Hello, everyone, and welcome on into Swish City. I am your host, Bruce Veliz, and welcome in to the first episode of our new series here on the channel. We're going to be diving in and exploring each team going into this season. We are less than a month from the start of actual NBA official games, and the preseason and training camp is just right around the corner. So a lot to break down in today's episode. As you can tell, we're going to be discussing the Brooklyn Nets. In each episode, we'll be diving and exploring every team. So if you do enjoy the content on these channels, make sure to hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for your favorite team coming up. Without further ado, let's dive in and let's break down the Brooklyn Nets off season. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about the Brooklyn Nets, and they're one of the first teams that we're going to be talking about because ultimately I do not think they're going to be atop of the Eastern Conference. I think they're going to be kind of near the bottom, seemingly from their draft picks and how their off-season truly did undertake. It does look like that will be the path for the Nets this year, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the Nets will be getting a lot of wins, but maybe the Nets will prove me wrong and a bunch of others like they did last year, as they seemingly did pretty decent in the Eastern Conference, finishing 12th. But going into this year, the Nets, I think, do have a lot of struggles with a little bit of a weakened roster, and that's going to come into play even with an Eastern Conference of being up for grabs, going to be very tough with the roster that is currently constructed. So let's dive in and let's look at the Nets offseason moves and then ultimately go over their predictions for this year as well. So I made this little graphic here on Canva. I want to give a huge shout out to my boss over on Bright Side of the Sun, John Voita. He's the one that I saw first make these, and he gave me his template. I obviously made some changes to it, made some differences and stuff like that, but obviously, this would not be done without him. I'm going to be giving him his much-deserved love over here. So definitely go check him out if you want to get some writing on the Phoenix Suns and or want to get some info just on the NBA in general. Check out his podcast, The Suns Jam. But without further ado, once again, let's dive in and let's look at the Brooklyn Nets. There's a lot on this graphic here, obviously. So let's veer and look to the left side first. And let's look at the additions that the Brooklyn Nets made, as they made a lot of transactions this offseason, with them being one of the only teams in the NBA having salary cap. They had to take on some bad contracts, and that will go into some of these trades that did transpire. The first move that the Nets did make this offseason was acquiring Terrence Mann, and this happened in the Kristaps Porzingis deal earlier in the offseason. The Nets were the third team to jump in and take on the Terrence Mann contract and ultimately got a first-round pick in that as well. That pick and ultimately ended up being Drake Powell, who the Nets selected at pick 22, which we'll get down to in a little bit as well down there. They also went and traded for Michael Porter Jr., trading away Cameron Johnson in that deal with getting a 2031 or 2032 unprotected first-round pick. The Nets take on Porter Jr.'s contract and will be looking to most likely translate Porter into being their number one option going into their team this year, trying to see what he can bring to their squad. They also went out and brought in two contracts, like I mentioned, with their salary cap. The first was a trade with the Miami Heat, taking on Haywood Highsmith's contract after he sustained an injury and getting some draft capital in that deal. And then also taking on Kobe Buffkin's contract from the Atlanta Hawks, and also taking on cash considerations and more draft capital for that. The Nets, like I mentioned, are going to be going towards the bottom, so getting all this extra draft capital for roster spots that they do have or can just fill in is very, very solid and a good idea in my game plan. Haywood Highsmith, like I mentioned, is injured coming into this season and is expected to be back around the trade deadline, and I don't ultimately even know if he's going to be playing for the Brooklyn Nets, maybe for like a week or a couple games, but I do think his trade stock is valued around the league to where teams could take a flyer on him for, another pick or so, where the Nets can flip him for even more draft capital on at the trade deadline. But those are the 5 players the Nets did acquire via trade this season. I do think Michael Porter Jr. is going to translate, be someone that can be pretty dominant for them, and we'll get into them in that a little bit when we look at the depth chart alongside maybe Terrence Mann. But some of these other guys maybe are just salary fillers or guys that are just going to try to rebound back on the Nets. Then when we look at who they drafted, they obviously had 5 draft picks in this class, and it was expected that the Nets would try to trade up, maybe move up in this class, not use all 5 of these picks. But even though everyone says in the NBA that there's rumors, you always have to expect the unexpected, and the Nets did just that, selecting all 5 players and taking players that ultimately play similar same positions. Igor Demon was their first selection in pick 8, which was a little bit of a controversial pick. Some people thought he was a lottery talent. Some people necessarily didn't think he could be with his not great shooting skill, but good, obviously, playmaking and a high IQ passing. But with the Nets also taking Nolan Traore and Ben Serif in this class as well, 2 other point guards that share very similar traits of that playmaking guard, it is a little bit of a confusing move from the Nets. But hey, maybe they want an all-out passer putting alongside their scorer in Cam Thomas and Michael Porter Jr., and this is the way the Nets can do that, making sure they at least hit on one of those players in either Igor Demon, Nolan Traore, or Ben Serif. They also took Drake Powell, like I mentioned, who they got, like I said, from that Atlanta Hawks trade. He's going to be someone that can kind of fit into that wing group, and I think could kind of maybe be a little bit of a younger version of a Cam Thomas or Michael Porter Jr., depending on what this team really does really push for. And they got Danny Wolf, one of the better passing and playmaking bigs. Once again, a little confusing with how they went with so much playmaking in this draft class, but maybe pairing him alongside some of these other bigs could give them some good upside and some double big lineups for the Brooklyn Nets. Ultimately, with these 5 selections, I would have gone a little different. Maybe would have went for a little bit more athletic player in one of those mid picks instead of, once again, taking multiple playmakers in this draft class, 2 even back to back. I think the Nets could have really capitalized on trying to get maybe a little bit of a rawer prospect in here, especially for how they're going to fare in this Eastern Conference. But ultimately, the Nets went this route, and we'll have to see how it pans out for them. So now that we've talked about the additions to the team, let's look at who the Nets lost. And the Nets ultimately didn't really lose that many players this off season. Obviously, they brought in these 5 rookies. They brought in 5 new faces, so they're going to have to lose some people, and they ultimately did, right? They traded away Cam Thomas, like I mentioned, for Michael Porter Jr. in that deal. Cam Johnson, Cam Johnson is obviously going to the Denver Nuggets, going to play a very similar role like Michael Porter Jr., maybe be a little bit more effective on the defensive end, maybe be a little bit of a better player in those off-ball scenarios alongside Nikola Jokic, and is on a cheaper contract. And that's obviously take on the bigger deal in Porter Jr., but do get that additional first-round pick. They also lost D'Angelo Russell, who they reacquired at the trade deadline. They brought him back into this team. He obviously goes and signs with the Dallas Mavericks. It was widely expected that D'Angelo Russell would leave this team, as obviously he wants to still compete and contend on one of those rosters. And they also lost Trendon Watford, someone that a lot of people thought could be brought back onto this Brooklyn Nets team as one of these kind of, inexperienced pieces, but someone that could maybe stand out with this squad. He's obviously not here. There's a bunch of other younger players that also have recently gotten waived from this Brooklyn Nets team. I did not include them on this list, but a bunch of other widely renowned names on the Nets are also not returning. And then their unsigned free agents are obviously Reese Beekman, and DeAnthony Melton. DeAnthony Melton, widely expected to potentially go back to the Golden State Warriors following their drama with the Jonathan Kuminga situation. Reese Beekman obviously played with the Warriors too, kind of a guy that might be on one of their Long Island teams or a G League roster, but I don't think is someone that has put himself in a position to earn an NBA contract at this point if he's not really fitting in with the Brooklyn Nets. So the Nets do lose some key pieces. Obviously, Cam Johnson, one of their guys who had been here for these last couple of seasons in that Kevin Durant trade. Now Cam Johnson and Mikal Bridges gone, D'Angelo Russell gone, some of their better players gone, but they do bring in some younger talent in here. So let's get into the depth chart and let's analyze what this Nets team is really bringing out this season. So when looking at the depth chart, you can already tell that the Nets are going to have to make some more moves down the line and even some cuts. As like I mentioned just a couple of seconds ago, they have waived a bunch of these kind of guys that are on some of these non-guaranteed deals or kind of cheaper contracts. And I think we're going to see that still transpires. The Nets still are 3 contracts over the limit. They are currently signed 18 guys here, and going into training camp, they can have up to 21 guys on the roster. Currently with their two-ways, they're at 20. But after that, the Brooklyn Nets, after training camp, when the start of the season happens, have to waive at least 3 of these players or trade them or do something of that jazz. And it's going to be kind of interesting to see where the Nets really do go in that situation. My projected starting 5 is going to be Igor Demin, obviously their 8th overall pick, the guy that they're going to put the most trust into being that playmaker and point guard to run that scenario. Cam Thomas obviously just re-signed on the qualifying offer. He's going to look to have an explosive offensive season, and I think having a secondary playmaker where he doesn't necessarily have to do it that all the time compared to last year is going to allow Cam Thomas to have that green light and maybe be a little bit more effective for this Brooklyn Nets squad. Obviously, Terrence Mann, he's looking to bounce back, try to prove himself after the Clippers had such a high value on him just a couple years ago, inserting himself at the small forward. Michael Porter Jr. filling himself into that starting power forward alongside Nicholas Claxton, which I think is going to be a great tandem with Porter Jr.'s ability to stretch the floor and be able to play on the perimeter, with Nicholas Claxton's ability to be a paint beast down low and to be that great rebounder that the Nets do have some high interest to. Now, looking at the bench unit here, this is where it gets a little confusing. Like I said, obviously Haywood Highsmith in that small forward position, he is expected to be out for the start of the season, and I don't even know is going to play for this Brooklyn Nets team. So I did include him, and he will be on the roster going into the year, but I do think won't really find a role in this depth chart. But if he were to play, this is where he would find himself into that backup small forward. You obviously got Day'Ron Sharpe, who's looking to have a big year this year as a backup big for this Brooklyn Nets team. Really has all those similar compliments that a guy Nick Claxton does, and I think if he can take that leap, could be someone very, very impactful for this Nets squad as well. Maybe even present himself to be a little bit of a good shadow behind Nick Claxton, to maybe even the Nets having to realize, hey, if Day'Ron Sharpe is this effective, we can run him at the starting center, maybe get even some more value for Nick Claxton to bring in some younger guys to beef up our squad to put us in that right direction. You also got Kobe Buffkin, who's looking to bounce back this year. He'll obviously be competing with those other 2 point guards in that rotation, and Nolan Traore and Ben Serif, who are still trying to obviously fight their way and try to prove to be that kind of backup or secondary point guard behind Igor Demin. Dariq Whitehead had a little bit of a bounce back year at the second half of last season. He's slated in the backup shooting guard, could play some backup point guard, but ultimately with them having so many point guards, I think it's going to be that backup too. Zaire Williams and Tyrese Martin playing that small forward position. Zaire Williams, obviously from the Memphis Grizzlies, got traded to the Nets last season. I think we'll kind of look to bounce back, just re-sign it there. Obviously trying to play some backup small forward with Highsmith being out, Tyrese Martin also competing there. Then you got in the backup power forward, Drake Powell, who's obviously a rookie trying to flourish in his way as a 3-and-D wing. You got Jalen Wilson, who also had some bright flashes for the Nets last year. Maybe he tries to rise to the occasion and try to be a player that can fit in the rotation. Drew Timme, who had a lot of success with the Long Island Nets, and in the end of last season, when the Nets were at the bottom trying to tank with all their injuries, had some really big games for them, and even in the Summer League had some good performances. Maybe he could be a guy to find himself on this roster. And then Noah Clowney and Danny Wolf. Danny Wolf, obviously, that probably third center. Noah Clowney, probably more into that power forward position. But with them having so many big men power forwards and centers, it's obviously kind of hard to decide. But once again, like I mentioned, the Nets at 18 players on the roster are going to have to cut 3 of these guys at the moment. Obviously, it's not expected that they're going to cut any of their rookies, but maybe they do look at a guy like a Dariq Whitehead, a Tyrese Martin, a Jalen Wilson, a Drew Timme. If one of them isn't panning out in training camp, to maybe cut one of them, or maybe look to make another move, trying to shed some more salary, trying to trade a player like Terrence Mann, or maybe try to trade a player like Noah Clowney, just because they have too much beef into this front court. And then lastly, looking at these two-way players, you got EJ Liddell, who has had some injuries, has bounced around, in Tyson Etienne, a guard. I do think that the Nets will go out and get one last two-way player. Maybe even one of these guys will turn into a two-way player. Ultimately, I don't know if any of them have the qualifications to become one of them, but that could be the case for one of these guys ending up getting waived, just going over and transitioning into another two-way player for this Nets team. But ultimately, that's where the Brooklyn Nets come into stand when looking at their depth chart, when looking at their two-way players, who they added and who they lost. This is the transactions of the Brooklyn Nets. So ultimately, with that prediction, where does it put them for me in the Eastern Conference? Like I stated, it has them ultimately closer to the bottom. I'm going to have them 15th in this Eastern Conference. Some of these other younger teams out here in the East, similar teams like the Raptors, the Bulls, the Wizards, even the Hornets, have at least some young, enticing pieces that really captivate themselves to mesh really well. Ultimately, with the Nets, it's a lot of banking on Cam Thomas and Michael Porter Jr. being those number 1 and number 2 scorers to really unleash and really take over, while guys like Igor Demon obviously kind of try to fit into be that playmaker. Nicholas Claxton dominates as a big man, and you have these kind of other rotational pieces really thriving. Ultimately, with the Nets, when you look down their depth chart, when you look at the rotation in the depth chart of the bench players, they're all younger players. So that's where I stand, to where I don't think they're going to have that experience to really captivate against some of these other opponents, and I think that's going to be one of their weak spots. Teams are going to use that to their advantage, and that's where I think the Nets are going to fall ultimately 15th, last in the Eastern Conference. But I do think they have a little bit of a bright future, all depending on what can happen with this team, right? If Michael Porter Jr. can really start to pan out and be a nice star, maybe they can flip him down the line and use that contract to get more assets. Maybe they could do something similar with Cam Thomas if he has a breakout season, secure him to a team-friendly contract for their team and really invest into him as a scorer. Ultimately, I don't necessarily know if Cam Thomas can be that number 1 or number 2 option for a contending team. I don't necessarily know if Michael Porter can do that either. But for the Brooklyn Nets, this is a little bit of a rebuilding year, trying to reset and trying to identify who's going to be that next star for them. And that's where we are going into this season. So once again, thank you guys so much for tuning into today's episode here, looking at the Nets. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section on your evaluation of the team and what you guys ultimately think they're going to do this season, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Have a great rest of your day, and peace out.